So thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union webinar series, NFUniversity. Our presenter today is Dr. Nate Hagens, and the topic is Energy and Material Blindness, a Systems Approach. Nate Hagens is the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Energy in Our Future, ISEOF. Allied with leading ecologists, experts in energy, politicians and systems thinkers, ISEOF assembles roadmaps and off-ramps for how human societies can adapt to lower throughput lifestyles. Nate is an author, educator, website editor, and the host of the very, very good podcast, and I urge everyone to subscribe and listen, The Great Simplification. Nate, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks so much, Darren. Good to see you all. Let me share my screen. How does that look, Darren? Is that good as before?
I'm not seeing it yet.
All right. Not seeing it?
Nope.
Oh, because you were sharing, maybe. Let me share screen.
It's coming up now.
All right. How about now?
Good. You're in presentation mode. Go ahead.
So you're seeing full screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. Darren, you have quite the radio disc jockey voice. I felt like I was sitting on my couch Sunday morning having coffee. Now it'll change to more college lecture / political debate sort of thing. I'm going to talk about the big picture facing society. And what I'm going to do is tell the story of how we got here, the situation, the implications for the future, and then the implications at the close for National Farmers Union and Canada and your work. So this is an unknown quote from Albert Einstein. If I only had an hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes finding the solution. Well, I'm going to spend 50 minutes defining the problem today. We live as part of a system, and the parts and the processes fit together, but our society has rewarded reductionist expertise, and a lot of the world's experts are siloed and don't fly up high enough to see how the parts and the processes fit together. As such, we live in a world of islands of expertise separated by oceans of nonsense or incoherence. So what I'm going to start with is an overview of the human ecosystem. Humans, in our modern 300,000 year later physiological form, and in the past, what we do is have ideas and inventions that we combine energy and materials to create products. And we represent all this by dollars or Canadian dollars or yuan or euros. And this is our economy. We do this all to replicate the same emotional states of our successful ancestors with feelings, and the entire system produces waste. I'm going to talk briefly about each of these, but I'm going to focus on energy because energy is something that our society doesn't really understand. So energy is the currency of life. In nature, animals and organisms that have an outsized energy payoff for their efforts have evolutionary advantages. The same thing in human systems. So energy is required for every single thing that contributes to global goods and services. We need energy to mine and invent and manufacture and assemble and deliver and run and maintain and repair and dispose of. At every single segment of our industrial supply process, we need energy. Energy, especially fossil energy, is incredibly powerful for what it does for us. I live in northern Wisconsin, not so far from where some of you are. This is my farm. I do the work on a good day of 1/10 of a horse. This is my horse, Binga, who on a good day, when motivated by butterscotch treats, can do the work of one horse. This green Rhino is my Yamaha utility vehicle with a little bit of gasoline. It can do the work of 45 horses. This is my truck with a little bit of diesel fuel. It can do the work of 300 horses. The next time you're flying across to Toronto or Vancouver, imagine 100,000 invisible horses pulling your plane across the sky. So a barrel of oil contains 5.7 million British thermal units worth of energy, which is 1,700 kilowatt hours worth of energy potential. And it takes an average human 4.5 years to output that same amount of work. So if you think about it, the global human economy uses 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents worth of the three main fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, every year in our global economy. The labor equivalent of that is effectively 500 billion human worker equivalents added to the 5 billion or so real human workers. So this is really the story of industrialization, where we added vast amounts of almost too cheap to meter energy that we extracted from the ground to machines in a very energy inefficient way. But since the energy was so cheap, it massively boosted our profits, et cetera. So we went from animal labor and humans to industrial looms and steam engines, and now today, air travel and aluminum smelting, et cetera. So let me show you the mathematical output of this. Where I live in Wisconsin, there's a lot of cow milking, and back in the day, people used to milk the cows by hands, and that would make $5 an hour. Then we introduced technology, parlor milking, and that added 180 times more energy than by hand, but it raised the output to $20 per hour per human involved. There's also a fully automated milking machine where the cows just walk through and there's very little human input. That requires 400 times more energy, but it raises the dollarly output to $25 per hour. Now, that $25 could be the wage for the farmer, or it could be the profits for the owner of the dairy, or it could be lower price milk for the consumers. This is the same graph with two additional colors added. The blue bars are what I just showed you. Now, if we double energy prices, it shows how sensitive this math is to an increase in energy cost. The orange bars show a doubling of electricity from 5 to 10 cents. And you see there's no impact on the manual milking example. And your profits are reduced a little bit in the intermediate example. Your profits in the very energy intensive example, where we have to use 400 times more energy in the system, drop sharply. But what happens if energy prices triple? Well, nothing happens in the hand milking. We still make we make good money, but a little bit less money in the intermediate example. But in the heavy energy intensive technology example, that used to be the most profitable, now it's actually losing money because we built a system that was predicated on, in this case, 5 cents a kilowatt hour continuing. So a few years ago, this might have seemed hypothetical to you, but we can see already what's happening in the last 6 months or so in Europe because of the Ukraine-Russia situation. Thousands of businesses that used the high-level milking equivalent in their chemical and industrial supply chains were either going out of business or cut output or had to go into more debt because they had to pay much higher energy prices. So historically then, what this has done, this access to this buried sunlight, is increased wages, increased profits, reduced the price of goods, and increased both the population and the goods and services per population in the world. Compared to the year 1500, which was 500 years ago, the human economy is now 1,000 times bigger, measured by number of humans times average consumption, than it was 500 years ago. So I have a MBA from the University of Chicago, which is one of the world's best business schools. I was there for 2 years. They never mentioned the word energy. So in economic textbooks, they just assume that energy is one of the many inputs into our economic function. $1,000 worth of natural gas is equivalent to $1,000 worth of beer mugs or bike helmets or audio headphones. But it underpins everything. So our culture has become energy blind. There's a circular economy model in modern economics where households demand things, businesses and firms produce the things, and there's this virtuous cycle. What this neglects is the source of the energy and materials that go into this, and the sink. Of course, many of you are aware of climate change and other pollution. So as a culture, we conflate the dollar value of energy with the work value of energy, and we hardly include the cost of pollution at all. So in effect, viewed from a long time period, our culture is drawing down the principle of the main input to our economies, but our stories, our narratives are treating it as if it were interest. All of us, from a 20,000-foot time aerial view, are alive during what might be called the carbon pulse, and which is this few hundred-year period where humans are drawing down ancient hydrocarbons 10 million times faster than they were trickle charged by the daily photosynthesis flows of Earth's distant past. So all of us are alive somewhere during the blue, between the blue and the red star in this graph. So let's talk about crude oil, which is liquid at room temperatures, incredibly energy dense, and it is the main source of global economic output. Oil for now is the economy. Shown here is a graph, a logarithmic graph on the bottom showing oil consumption, and on the left, GDP per country. And you can see that R squared is 0.96. So how much oil is left? Do we have hundreds of years? Are we running out? What's the story? So here again, there is a narrative difference between economists and what you would consider my profession, which is a biophysical economist. You hear in the news, drill, baby, drill. And this shows that the 1970 peak in United States oil production, then we declined for 40 years, and then technology overcame depletion, and we went off to new highs. So technology can overcome these problems. Well, viewed from a biophysical perspective, here is the same exact chart broken out by geographical province. The green shows the light, sweet, high-quality conventional crude oil in the United States. The yellow shows the North Slope in Alaska, which isn't even contiguous to the United States. It's contiguous to Canada, but is part of the United States. The blue shows the Gulf of Mexico, which isn't even land, it's under the ocean. And the red is the light tight oil, or also called shale oil, which is the source rock where all other oil migrated from. There is nothing left after shale oil, other than oil shale, which is kerogen, which is the energy density of a baked potato. But this is what we're going after now, and it declines very rapidly. New oil wells drilled in tight oil decline at 80 to 90% in the first 18 months. This graph shows that we are drilling faster and faster just to stay in place. The United States has more oil wells drilled than the rest of the world combined. The gray here shows all wells in the United States drilled before 2014 and their decline profile. The orange shows 2014, the blue 2015, all the way to the orange, which is new wells drilled in 2020, and the blue 2021. If the United States stopped drilling oil wells for whatever reason, for environmental reason, for a financial reason, for a political reason, our oil production would decline at 37%. Our total oil production would decline by 37% in the first year, and another 20-some% in the second year, and another 20% the year after that. We have to keep drilling to maintain this level of output. Now, are we running out? Well, we were running out from the first well that was drilled in 1859. There is plenty of oil left. It's going to be more costly, both in environment and energy and dollar terms. And more importantly, the geopolitical availability of oil is different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So there are many countries in the world that produce oil. Actually, Mother Nature produced oil. We are extracting oil from under the ground. But there are far fewer countries that have enough after their internal use to in turn export oil. The United States is not one of those countries. Canada is. But if you look at this graph, Russia has around 22% of the world's oil exports and 25% of the world's natural gas exports. If you combine Russia and Saudi Arabia together, it's around 43% of the available oil for purchase in the world. What about renewable energy? Why can't we just get rid of this incredibly powerful fossil energy and replace it with solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, et cetera? Well, I'm not going to talk about hydro, but in Canada, you have incredible advantages that a lot of places in the United States don't have, because hydro is pretty special. It's just not scalable much beyond what we have now. First of all is the name. Renewable energy is a misnomer. The sun is renewable. The wind is renewable. The devices that humans invent and manufacture to harness the sun and the wind are incredibly complicated, requiring 6 continent supply chains, rare earth minerals, copper, lots of water invested in the manufacture. So they are rebuildable. They're no more renewable than a pickup truck. The other challenge is that when we talk about renewable energy, 80% of the world's energy use is non-electric, like transportation and heating and things like that. So most renewable energy produces electricity, when that is only a tiny part of the global energy mix. Now, we can change some of the things that we currently don't electrify to electrify them, but some things we can't change and other things we can only change at a large cost. The other challenge with renewable energy is, other than 2020, COVID, other than 2009, the great financial crisis, other than a couple years in the 1970s of the Middle East energy crisis, other than the Great Depression in the 1930s, and other than the world wars, every single year in the last 100 years, global human society has had more and more energy than the year before. But sometime soon, I could argue very soon, this subsidy of an army of 500 billion fossil workers is going to start to decline. So what role will technology and renewable energy have when this 500 billion turns to 450 billion helpers, and then 400 billion helpers, and then 350 billion helpers? Another challenge is, at the margin, it is true that adding some solar or wind to a city's electricity mix is cheap and robust, and the technology does exist and it's very powerful, and relative to 50 years ago, it's amazing. That's good. But it's the full cost of the system that matters. And the more that we scale renewable energy, the more we're going to have to pay for batteries and intermittent and backup and other complexity to the system. And full cost, it is much more expensive than just flicking on a natural gas peaker plant. And then finally, for those of you that care about climate change, which I would hope is most of you, rapid renewable energy growth is not reducing our emissions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there's this implicit assumption, let's grow more renewable energy to save climate. That is not what's happening. We are growing our fossil energy in absolute terms more than we're growing renewable energy, even though renewable energy is growing much faster. Briefly on materials. So this is a picture from my Earth Day talk last year where I made some tarot cards about the biophysical economy, but something I call the Trinity, which is every time we generate GDP, for sure we need three things, actually four things. We need energy, we need materials, and we need some technology. The fourth thing is a monetary marker. So GDP, energy, and materials are incredibly tightly linked. Shown in the orange line is global GDP, which would also be called gross world product. And the purple is the global material footprint. Energy and GDP are 99% correlated. Materials and GDP are 100% correlated. So, and then the green line is emissions, and that's very correlated, but not as tightly. One of the problems with the current renewable energy story is that if we decarbonize to the level required and advertise, it's going to lead to a rematerialization of our economies because we're going to need massive amounts of lithium, copper, cobalt, and rare earth minerals. A lot of these metals and minerals are found in countries that already have political and economic strife in the global south, and increasingly are going to be subject to higher wet bulb temperatures and impacts from climate, making business arrangements to get 1 to 2 or maybe even 3 orders of magnitude more copper and metals difficult, more difficult than the pro forma. What about technology? Technology seems in our cultural narrative to be able to handle all these problems. There's 2 types of technology. Type 1 is finding ways to create or find energy, like solar panels, or finding ways to use our existing energy more efficiently, like in a coal power plant or something like that. Type 2 energy is inventing things that replace tasks that humans used to do manually or with draft animals, like a chainsaw or driving a car, or new things that humans never used to have that require energy. Type 2 energy dominates type 2 technology dominates the technological invention space. And what this ends up being is it creates a higher base load for future energy requirements. And this manifests as such. This graph shows global energy use stacked by different type the last 200 years, biomass followed by coal, oil, natural gas in the colors. The black line shows the energy intensity of GDP, how much energy we use to generate $1 of GDP. And we can see that humans get more efficient over time. We have energy efficiency and innovation approximately 1.1% every year on average the last 100 years. So we're getting more energy efficient and smarter. However, we can see that we're also using more and more energy. Energy efficiency increased 36% in the last 30 years, but energy consumption has increased 63%. Briefly on money, economics textbooks teach us that money in banks is lent out from existing capital, and this is not true. The reality is that the majority of money is lent into existence when a loan is created. If Darren goes to the National Bank of Saskatoon and wants $1 million Canadian to start a carp farm, he's a nice guy. He's got a good radio voice and his credit is good. They put $1 million Canadian in his bank account, and at the same time, they put an IOU on their bank account. So from a banking perspective, the system is in balance. From a biophysical perspective, though, there's $1 million new Canadian dollars existing in the world that can be spent on things like oil or whatever Darren wants to spend it on. More dollars in the system, the same amount of oil, forests, dolphins, and biospheres there was before the loan was made. Reiterate that. Banks don't lend money, they create it. Feelings. Why do we do all this stuff? We are not fitness maximizers. We don't go through our modern lives trying to maximize the number of offspring as discussed in biological textbooks. We are instead adaptation executors. We go through our life trying to get the same approximate emotional states of our ancestors. Shown here is a hunter-gatherer looking for a Gemsbok or an impala next to a Wall Street stock trader. The same neurotransmitters in their brain are firing and motivating their behavior. On top of this, we have steep discount rates. We care about the present more than the future. We're incredibly status-oriented. We care about how we are perceived to others. We have a list of cognitive biases as long as my arm. We're incredibly social creatures and other aspects of human behavior. Pollution, I'm not going to give a climate lecture here because you're all aware of it, but CO2 is but one aspect of our pollution from our modern economy. There's also forever chemicals and biodiversity loss. Since I was born in the late 60s, we have lost 70% of the populations of animals, fish, birds, and insects. That's a very horrible thing to say. By the way, the oceans are kind of out of sight, out of mind. 90% of the heat from our industrial activity of the global economy has been absorbed by the oceans. So the human ecosystem, I've just summarized briefly. And how do we keep track of this? Our culture keeps track of how we're doing, how successful we are by GDP, or globally GWP. But every single thing that contributes to economic growth in the world started somewhere with a small fire. Energy and GWP are incredibly tightly linked, and they will remain that. We might get more efficient, but with the rebound effect, et cetera, as long as GDP is our cultural goal, our energy consumption and our trajectory will increase. This is an aerial view of the city of Los Angeles, and you can see the brake lights and the headlights are not too dissimilar than the veins and arteries in a human body transporting hemoglobin around the body, and oil is the hemoglobin, not so metaphorical, of our global economy. Here's a global supply chain, transportation aerial view of planes and ships, et cetera. So my research, my academic paper on this is that global human culture is functioning as an energy dissipating structure, a mindless superorganism where we've outsourced the decision-making to the market system. This is akin to a simple amoeba just sloughing forward in time, looking for more energy. From this perspective, and this is a kind of a horrifying thing to contemplate, there is no one in charge. There are not politicians or billionaires that are steering this ship. The ship is being steered by the market system, and the politicians and billionaires are in thrall to that. There is no one steering the bus. Back to climate. Look at all of the major international conferences on climate change the last 50 years. CO2 continues its relentless pace upward. 2022 was an all-time high in emissions in the power sector, China and Europe about the most environmentally friendly place in the world, increasing their emissions in the face of what happened with Ukraine and Russia last year. So from a biophysical perspective, expecting humans to leave fossil fuels in the ground, expecting that to succeed as a cultural narrative is about as effective as arguing with a forest fire. Okay, that's the story. So what is the situation? This is a conceptual graph showing over time, deep time, humans accessed the biogeochemical flows of the sun, the rain, and the soil to reach kind of a sustainable scale back in the day. And then there was a different curve that we overlaid. Instead of farming horizontally, we started to farm vertically under the ground to get ores and energy. These resources are non-renewable on human timescales, and their extraction follows something akin to a normal curve, a pulse, as you will. Oil would be one of them. On top of all that, we've overlaid a different sort of curve, monetary representations of reality. This we can create and increase with a keystroke. There's nothing physical required for this. Banks don't loan out existing money, they create it. So with access to this incredibly potent source, our system grew so fast and large that land and land productivity no longer explained our wealth, and this became capital and labor in the economic textbooks. And now using this social construct of credit, kind of like a magic wand that transports resources from the future to today, we pulled resources even closer to the present and away from the future. Our society now, Canadian society, United States, Europe, the world, views the world through a financial market lens. We've not only financialized the human experience, but also the explanation of it. All key decision makers in our world are expecting this black line to continue. Every government in the world is expecting 2.5% to 3% economic growth in perpetuity. There is no credible institution that is expecting a departure from that dotted red line. And that, in other words, either they don't think that growth could end, or they're afraid to say that growth could end. But growth is a special circumstance in our history. Only the last 150 or 200 years have we had protracted growth on the backs of the carbon pulse. For most of the last 2,000 years, we had flat to declining growth, and interspersed by periods of growth. So all of the economic theory and our projections for the future were created during this red rectangle in the upper right. We continue to grow globally, but productivity, which is the engine of growth, peaked 50 years ago at exactly the same time that global oil extraction peaked at 7 or 8% a year. So we're still growing, but we're growing at a smaller amount. And the reason that we're even growing at all is because of credit and debt. We're papering over our problems with more and more credit, while the energetic and material basis for our currencies declines. So under this framing, what is not likely to happen? Growing the economy and mitigating climate change and the sixth mass extinction, growing the economy by replacing the bad energy, fossil fuels, with the good energy, renewables, culture en masse choosing to leave fossil hydrocarbons in the ground, and governments and government representatives and politicians embracing limits to growth before those limits are well in the rearview mirror. So under this framing, what is likely to happen? The growth in gross energy, while net energy, which is the amount of energy outside of the energy sector, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, actually declines. Massive monetary creation and financial market support by central banks and governments, basic income support for more people, a rightward shift in politics as people prefer the way things used to be and change gets voted against, a reduction in global environmental regulations, pedal to the metal until we hit a wall. The superorganism is pulling this momentum, this metabolism forward. All right, so I see two scenarios going forward. Before I get to those, let me recap what's happened the last couple hundred years. Shown here in the red lines, the far left red line is when Thomas Malthus was alive, and you've all heard of him. Some people, you might even think of me as a neo-Malthusian. Thomas Malthus was wrong. He was wrong because he didn't know about fossil hydrocarbons. In 1969, my friend Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, saying some of the things I'm saying to you today and making some bad predictions. Paul was wrong because he didn't know about the impact of globalization, outsourcing to the least cost area, nor did he imagine that from the year of that book until today, the global economy has grown our debt more every year than we've grown the size of the economy. The next red line is 2009, when the global central banks took over the role of credit creation from the global commercial banks. Then we had 2020, where COVID resulted in all kinds of rule changes and stimulus checks and bazooka responses from the global central banks, and we continue to kick cans. Personally, I think at some point in the future, the next can to kick is one in our minds, where we realize we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy, but there could be some new innovation from artificial intelligence or some new energy source or energy discovery or technological innovation. But here's the rub. If energy and GDP are incredibly correlated, if we double this, if we grow our economy at 3% a year, we will double the amount of energy and materials used in our economy in the next 30 years and double it again in the 30 years after that. So your high school children today, by the time they're in their 70s, will see a 4 times the size and scale of the human economy. So I think scenario one is that we do continue to grow, but I call this the Mordor economy, because what's going to happen is in 1999, we hit a 700-year low of the amount of GDP that was directed to the energy sector at 5%, meaning that 95% of our energy could be used by hospitals and Zoom calls and universities and shopping centers and sports. Now that's around 11%. So we're directing more and more of our energy and materials towards the Alberta tar sands, towards shale oil, towards complicated energy systems. So the Mordor economy is a theoretical destination. I don't actually think it will happen. But what I mean to imply by this is if we continue to grow in a biophysically constrained economy, more and more of our energy will go to the energy sector and the environmental remediation sector, shown here by the flying vacuum cleaners, sucking CO2 out of the air, leaving much less for the discretionary aspect of society that we've come to enjoy. The other scenario is the name of my podcast and the name of my little animated movie online, The Great Simplification. This will occur when we remove the ubiquitous availability of low productivity credit, which has fueled economic growth for the last 50 years, with a shift to more costly light tight oil, copper that's very few parts per 100 of copper ore, more costly resource access, and the complexity of a return to primarily solar inputs. This could be manageable, except we've papered over our situation for 50 years with debt. So I expect there will be a sharp reduction in the next 10 years, probably, of the size of our global economy. And I refer to this not as a simplification, but as a great simplification, because I believe it will be probably the greatest event that humanity ever experiences writ large. We have pursued many, many centuries and millennia where humans solve problems by adding complexity. Complexity requires energy. And if we don't have the amount of energy that we are used to, that have built this moment, we're going to simplify. So the unspoken scenario, if we imagine what Vancouver or Toronto or Prince Edward Island look like 50 years from now, or in the year 2050, what is the scale? What is the energy mix? What is the cultural aspiration? What is the equality? What is the environment? What is the governance? In my view, the road is closed to our current cultural expectations and narratives, and we have a few roadblocks between here and there. I didn't talk about this much, but we are losing trust in the social contract because of the social media polarization, now advanced artificial intelligence, et cetera. We have, as I just spoke, probably a likely date with a financial recalibration in the next decade or so. We have an issue with, if the global pie is about to get smaller, does that create a geopolitical phase shift in the movement from a unipolar to a multipolar world? And finally, ongoing response to a warming climate and ecosystem degradation. So what are the implications of all this? Main points: cheap, abundant fossil energy underpins our society. This is a stock, but we've treated it as a flow. Growth, as measured by GDP, is probably soon over. And the first major challenge we face is going to be responding to a financial recalibration. We do not face a resource shortage, but rather a long edge of expectations. The average American and Canadian uses 100 times more energy than our bodies need in the form of food calories. So there's a lot of room for change that doesn't have to be a disaster. Not the same in every country in the world. Renewables, nuclear technology are the right answers to the wrong question. We are using those things to avoid difficult decisions on changing our economics, our institutions, our aspirations, and just saying, oh, renewables and nuclear, we can continue consuming the way we are today. Renewables and nuclear can play a role in a great civilization, just not the one we have today. What I'm telling you today cannot be voiced aloud by the prime minister or president of a country. It's too politically difficult. So these things have to be discussed in back rooms, and there are parts of this message that can be shared widely. On the best things in life are free, and self-worth is the new net worth, and social capital is one of the most important things you can have. But the intensity and severity of this situation is not likely to be happening in our nation's capitals. There also is a biophysical phase shift occurring in the global economy. Look at what's happening with Russia and China and the de-dollarization right now, where many countries, Malaysia, the most recent example, are shifting how they buy commodities from US dollars to some other basket of currencies. You're seeing China broker Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia exports 22% of the world's available oil exports. These are tectonic shifts in how the global commerce and our expectations of the last 30 years are about to change. And lastly, like I just said, our current amount of technology and amount of natural resources remaining can power a viable culture well into the future, just not the one we currently have. Okay, so briefly, what does this mean for some of your work? And I don't know Darren too well. He sent me a book and his book, and we've talked a little bit about this, but here are just some brief suggestions in my remaining few minutes. So we live in a world of reductionist expertise, except farmers are kind of already partly up there in their aerial view, because you have to look at your inputs and your outputs in a way that just conventional financial industrial minds don't. So farmers actually are an easier sell for this sort of story because they see a lot of these interconnections already. So in my view, our cultural narratives are going to continue this red line, even when the red line becomes even less likely to happen. We're going to double down on the cultural narratives that it will and must continue. We don't have a lot of people following the blue line, which is preparing our countries for a lower material and energetic and consumption future. So the fact that you have an NFU, a union of farmers and biophysically minded people, is a huge thing. The United States doesn't have a national farmers union. So what is this midpoint that you could start? You don't have to agree with everything I've said here. Even if you think that what I'm saying is 10% plausible, it behooves you to do scenario planning for what this might mean for the country of Canada and for your food systems, and start doing scenario analysis. And that's how this starts. The conversation widens out. So many of you have probably heard the kind of trite comment that we use 10 fossil calories to produce 1 food calorie. That's not exactly correct. The truth is shown in this graph that we use between 10 and 14 fossil calories to get 1 food calorie to your plate. But a lot of that is the transportation, the processing, the packaging, the household storage, and waste. The real number is around 1.75 units of energy to create 1 unit of food energy. But what we're going to need to do with these supply chains is, as the world becomes a bigger place again, and you've got incredibly complex inputs for tractors and farm machinery and fertilizer and things coming from all over the world in a 6-continent supply chain, we're going to have to relocalize and re-regionalize supply chains to be more resilient. And this is not being planned for, because globalization at the scale that we've had the last 50 years is expected to continue. Another idea is the entire farm and commodity business has been optimized on labor or time efficiency. So we try to get more and more efficient and use the less inputs so that the human input, the guy driving the tractor or the people working on the farm, that we get the most economic output per hour of their labor. I would argue that we're going to have to redefine efficiency away from such a simplistic metric and change it to maybe how do we optimize for health? How do we optimize for local and regional supply chains? How do we optimize for soil and for climate? This is part of the superorganism story, is that we've parsed everything of value in the human system into 1 metric, dollars. And I think if you take a portfolio approach to your work at the National Farmers Union in the future, yes, we have to make money. That's what our world runs on. But just like adding some gold or some cash to a financial portfolio of stocks and bonds reduces your fluctuation and risk, adding some regenerative strategies. Here's another big problem. So one of the reasons that fossil adding nitrogen to fields boosted our global yield so much is because when we invented the Haber-Bosch and started to use this, there was tons of organic matter in the soil. And so that, in combination with the nitrogen, boosted our yields. But now that amount of organic matter is about half of what it was when we started adding fossil fuel, natural gas derived nitrogen fertilizers. So now we're in a worse position than we were 80 or 100 years ago, because the organic matter in the soil, not everywhere, but on average, is much less. So we're even just like a sugar or alcohol addict wants that next fix, we need to add this amount of nitrogen to the soil, which is why, soil as well as energy is kind of a national resource. So we need to protect and regenerate the soil. I'll leave you with this final quote. When a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. And I hope I've helped to do that in a small way with you on this call today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nate. Really, really appreciated that presentation. Thanks for bringing that to us today.